Hello everyone, great, welcome back to another fantasy video. It's been a while, but I really needed to get some fantasy videos done. I'm going to try not to be too long, it might be a bit of a longer video. I'm going to try to keep it under control, but still I'd probably get a drink and maybe some models to paint if I was you. We're talking about two things today, which you've probably seen already from the title and the thumbnail. I'm going to probably, answer them both at the same time mostly, because they're going to be pretty much talking about them at the same time and answering both questions together. And they're two things that I've either seen around a lot or heard a lot, and they're just things that I figure I'm going to talk about. So one of them is the question I've seen around in comment sections on Facebook groups, that sort of thing. Could Stormcast have fitted into Warhammer Fantasy? Could the Age of Sigmar models have fitted into into Fantasy without destroying the setting, without ruining everything, without turning it into Age of Sigmar? Essentially, could you put Stormcast into Warhammer Fantasy and maybe some other of the new Age of Sigmar races into Fantasy without messing up the setting and changing Warhammer Fantasy into Age of Sigmar? And the other question, well, it's not a question so much, the other thing to talk about is people, especially when you talk about fantasy, people tend to say, oh, and you could do better, could you? Oh, you whinge about Age of Sigmar, but you couldn't do better, could you? What are your ideas? Who are you? You're nobody. Who are you? You grumpy neckbeard, salty gatekeeper neckbeard. Who are you to argue with a boardroom of stiffs in suits at Games Workshop, and the crap they've made up. So I'm going to be also giving you sort of my idea, what I would have done if I was Mr. Warhammer Man, what I would have done in place of Age of Sigmar, how I would have adapted fantasy into the 9th Age and incorporated some of the things that we have in Age of Sigmar into the fantasy world while keeping it mostly intact. So to get started, I'm going to paint you a picture. We're going to go back to the first End Times book, Nagash. I'm sitting over to one side, by the way, because I'm probably going to put some pictures on one side so you can sort of see what I'm talking about as we go along. So I'm going to paint you a picture of this book because it's very important. I was going to talk about this topic specifically in a very long video where I talk about all the End Times books, but I decided nobody's going to watch that probably, so I'll make a shorter video where I just talk about these specific points because I was planning to cover them in the longer video anyway, but I think they deserve their own video, otherwise they'll just get lost and buried and nobody will really ever see it. So, Nagash. This was before anybody was expecting the world to just blow up. Yes, it was called the End Times, but we've had the Storm of Chaos, we've had various other things. Being called the End Times didn't suggest they were going to destroy everything the way that they did, and so initially people were very excited for the less so going along once we sort of realised the trajectory and what was ultimately going to happen. But to begin with, for the first couple of books at least, and especially Nagash, we were very, very excited. This was the biggest thing to happen to Warhammer Fantasy for a very long time, the most exciting thing to happen to Warhammer Fantasy for a very long time. There had been a number of petty campaigns nobody really cared about, mostly slipping straight under the radar. There was Blood in the Badlands, I think that was like dwarfs and goblins or something. There was Sigmar's Blood, which was some kind of vampire counts versus empire type thing. They mostly slipped under the radar, I think. Nobody really cared about them. Shame, because the books are expensive now. I'd like to have them, but never mind. And really, other than that, the most big, exciting thing that had happened with Warhammer Fantasy was the 25th anniversary. I don't know how well you can see this shirt. This is the 25th anniversary shirt. They did dice, metal dice. They had the Harry the Hammer, Harold Hammerstorm model, big metal model of the guy, in this picture that was on the front of the first rulebook. Posters. They did a big white dwarf where they had a 25,000 point game that they played for 25 hours. I don't know who. I couldn't imagine playing a giant game of Warhammer Fantasy for 25 hours straight. Gets me, enough of a headache just doing a couple of hours for a regular size game because it's pretty intensive. But they did. That's really the biggest, most exciting thing they've done, I would say, since the Storm of Chaos. Storm of Chaos was quite a big campaign too, quite a big campaign. Certainly made more of a splash than the Blood in the Badlands, Sigmar's Blood, that sort of thing. However, Nagash, when this came out, oof, heavy book. This was massive. It was so massive that it shocked Games Workshop. It took them completely by surprise. I think when they brought out these End Times books, they weren't expecting there to be as much of a fantasy audience as there was, as they turned out to be. I expect they imagined, there'd be a few diehard old players who would care and buy these up, but unfortunately, and it's why it's so sad that they did, had already obviously made the decision by this point, it revealed how many people actually played and liked and cared about Warhammer Fantasy, because these books were massive, the excitement was massive, people were hyped, and it was so bad that these books actually, to Games Workshop's surprise and to everybody else's extreme panic, these books sold out. Not the collector's editions, the limited edition ones, which they did have. They were still hardback like this, but a bit bigger and fancier. They maybe got a poster or something. They obviously sold out within seconds. But these are just normal books they were putting out. These are, normal. What they said about Curse City, when they go, it's Curse City and it's standard stock, it'll be here forever, don't worry. Then that sold out in a day too. But that's the kind of thing, that's normal now. But back then, this was actually shocking. This wasn't supposed to sell out. This was just the book that they're doing for the End Times. But it was so big, sold out, and people were panicking, people were hounding them. Games Workshop, I need my book. This is the Nagash book. I need my book. Where can I buy it? And Games Workshop were going, oh God, we weren't expecting to sell this many copies. And got really backpedaled and ended up making these softbacks, sort of made to order, not made to order, but sort of emergency issue softbacks, where they're like, whoa, sorry, there is way more demand than we expected. We're not going to produce these, but if you give us a couple of months, we'll get softbacks out, so anybody who missed out on these can buy softbacks. So it was huge. Now, why was it so huge? Well, for a long time, some of the problems with Warhammer Fantasy was stagnancy. You get the same issue with stagnancy in 40k. It's been a bit annoying recently in 9th edition with the whole big warp rift thing they've done. KD was destroyed. There's a big warp rift now, but ultimately nothing has changed. That tended to be a problem with Warhammer Fantasy. You could do bits and pieces, but nothing really ever changed the setting as such. And for a long time, the big bad for Warhammer Fantasy has been Archaon. Now, Archaon is great. Lots of people like Archaon. He has really badass stories. He looks he used to look badass. The new model is just sort of big, messy lump of crap. You can't tell what it's supposed to be. It's terrible. But the old model is one of the most classic, iconic, and honestly just sleek-looking models they've ever done, in my opinion. And a lot of other people's opinions too. Archaon, he's an old character from all the way back here in 1998, Champions of Chaos. Then he got remade for Hordes of Chaos in 2004, I think this book was. 2006 maybe. And then of course he had his limelight, his heyday with the Storm of Chaos. So he's been around for a long time. He's been a big bad, Sauron style villain, living up in the Chaos Wastes with his, armies of chaos that are really huge for some reason, even though they don't really know where all the people come from. But the thing is, as good as he is, he's been there for a long time, and he's had the Storm of Chaos. After the Storm of Chaos, we then had 7th and 8th edition Chaos army books where they didn't specifically retcon it. However, the timeline in those books was once again leading up to Archaon's big invasion, leading you to believe that the Storm of Chaos hadn't happened, and you were being led up to the Storm of Chaos, or as it turned out, the End Times. But they essentially, after he's even had his 6th edition big bad Storm of Chaos, the 7th and 8th edition army books went straight back to just having him being kind of a looming threat. So you've had Archaon living up in the Chaos Wastes with the armies of Chaos up in the north for a very long time, not really doing very much. All you had is campaign. Nagash coming back. Nagash is one of the main big bads for Warhammer Fantasy. As powerful, even potentially more powerful than Archaon. I'm a fanboy, so I'd argue not, but realistically he is. He's definitely one of the big villains. If there was some kind of giant Godfather table with all the big bads from Warhammer Fantasy, he'd probably be at the head. And he's been out of the scene for a long time. I forget whether the last time was the time he was killed by Sigmar, or the time he was killed by the Skaven with the Fellblade, or maybe something else entirely. He's been out of the picture for a long, long time, and him coming back is absolutely massive. It was huge. It's exciting from people from a model perspective. He was the first sort of big centerpiece model they've started. They do them all the time now, but when Nagash came out, that was a striking centerpiece model. Really, really impressive. Crazy, steps in a new direction type model. So from a model perspective, he excited people. If you were an undead fan, getting your big bad back was exciting. And even if you were just somebody who enjoyed Warhammer Fantasy for the fluff aspect, narratively, absolutely groundbreaking, narratively huge. Now, I think that how he came back could have been done better. I like the idea that he was summoned in Sylvania by the vampire Manfred von Carstein. I feel like keeping his resurrection there was a good idea. He then goes and invades Khemri and attacks Settra the Imperishable and the Tomb Kings. Now, unfortunately, the result of this is that they get rid of the Tomb Kings. They drop the Tomb King line and say, that's it, they're done now. I think he should have just killed Settra, and then just claimed Khemri as his kingdom, and they should have kept the Tomb Kings around, and they should have just rolled it together into the old undead book like it used to be when it was just undead as a faction. And you could have had the choice to have played, both combined in the same army, or just vampire count type skeletons, or just Tomb King type skeletons. But either way, Nagash is back, and he settles in the south. Well, I'm talking about now what he should have done. Settles in the south and just creates this empire of undeath. He just is in the south now, a big bad villain of undeath, with his kingdom of the dead spreading across the Khemrian desert. Absolutely, it would have been so cool, to have Archaon up in the north with his chaos hordes, and then Nagash down in the south with his empire of the dead, and then the rest of the old world kind of sandwiched, kind of the filling in this big evil sandwich, with the chaos at the top and the undead empire down the bottom. And what that would have done, what I would have done with that is wasn't a fan of it when they made them full army books for the Age of Sigmar, but during the end times, I didn't mind the Grand Alliances, because this is a desperate time, desperate measures. Can't be petty, can't just have grudges and stuff all the time. So the Grand Alliances I actually fairly liked. I think that with Archaon up in the north, Nagash and his Empire of the Dead down in the south, I think I liked the idea of having, the Empire strengthen their ties with Britannia and Tilia and Estalia, and then Kislev, maybe Cathay come into it. You could have had the High Elves reach out to the Slann and combine with the Lizard Men, adding their old ancient knowledge together. The Dwarfs come back and start helping the Empire a bit more, drop their grudges. You could have had Chaos and Skaven, just like you could in that old Mark of Chaos video game. You could have had the Orcs and Goblins and the Ogre Kingdom sort of combining their forces into some kind of elemental force of nature, just natural disaster, just this enormous alliance of stuff that just wants to fight you and kill you and eat everything it comes across. I was looking forward to using my Bretonnians with Wood Elves too. That would have been nice, Bretonnians and Wood Elves fighting together. So, point is, you have two giant evil enemies up in the north, down in the south. So the rest of the old world is coming together a bit more with kindred spirits, human kingdom sticking together, other monstrous things sticking together, people with ancient knowledge sticking together, that sort of thing. And this is leading me on to how could Stormcast have come around. Now, the way I would have gone about Stormcast personally, and what I've just been talking about, what I'm still talking about, is essentially my alternative reality to Age of Sigmar, what I would have done if I was in charge. And we're going to start answering the question of, could Stormcast exist in fantasy, that sort of thing. Because what I would have done is I would have had, similar to what they did in the end of the last End Times book, the Archaon End Times book, when Sigmar had essentially possessed Karl Franz. I would have done something similar, but with Vultan. He wouldn't have been a full possession. I don't like the idea of there being a sort of god emperor of mankind, demigod, just sort of, omnipotently powerful, walking around smiting people type deal. But definitely I would have had Vultan be not just the chosen of Sigmar, but the sort of vessel of Sigmar, mouth of Sigmar, word of Sigmar. Just Vultan. So he's just on fire. He's got orange, gold lightning coming out of his eyes, and he speaks prayers with such volume that the Chaos Warrior's heads just explode, and he can smack with his giant hammer like a thunderclap and just obliterate Chaos Dragons. Just ridiculously powerful. He is the walking voice of Sigmar, because a lot of people within the Empire, they kind of know Sigmar is kind of a thing, but don't really believe, because for the most part, gods, Chaos gods can do a lot, but the Empire gods in particular, especially Sigmar, really don't do very much to prove their existence. Aside from maybe answering the odd prayer for a warrior priest every now and then, making his hammer glow, that sort of thing, doesn't really get up to much. So for a lot of people in the Empire, Sigmar is just a thing. It's just something that the religious people care about, and they don't, because they're too busy struggling to just live their lives. And that's the sort of thing. But with Vultan, if he had this sort of holy vessel of Sigmar type thing going on, he'd have been living, walking proof that Sigmar is their god and he's powerful, and the time is desperate enough that people need to really put their faith in Sigmar and take things seriously. And what I would have done is I'd have had the Church of Sigmar quadruple, septuple, massively duplicate in strength and power and influence. Because now that Sigmar was a real bastion of hope to the people, besieged, above and below by the hordes of Chaos, Archaon, the hordes of the undead, Nagash, Skaven, whatever it might be, faith in Sigmar is at an all-time high now. And with Vultan at the head, what I would have done is, I think Stormcast could have worked, with some tweaks, obviously not exactly Stormcast, but still, basically what Games Workshop wanted, would have been to have expanded the warrior priest orders. Instead of, warrior priests are essentially, they're few and far between. They're especially brave people. Not everybody who worships Sigmar is a warrior priest. But I would have made, whether it's the Order of Sigmar, the Order of the Anvil, the Order of the Hammer, that sort of thing, I would have just had the Church of Sigmar become a hugely militant order. And they take in loads and loads of new recruits, loads and loads of new would-be knights, would-be priests, that sort of thing, and put them through intense training regimes, just working out all day, every day, training with weapons all day, every day, getting absolutely yoked, just massive, the kind of guys you see in the artwork all the time. I'll try to get some. They look like Arnold Schwarzenegger with a big bold head and a giant warhammer, huge heavy armour, absolutely beastly. Making not just hundreds but thousands of them, just making that the new thing underneath Vultan. It's the Church of Sigmar, the Army of Sigmar, the Order of the Warrior Priests, and they just train as many people as they can to become warrior priests. And not only that, because the dwarfs have come back, they work with the human blacksmiths and they create this Gromril full plate, not this stupid golden Spartan looking crap that the Stormcast have, but proper, like Gothic armour on steroids, proper full plate harness, fluted Gothic armour made out of Gromril, forged by the dwarfs in alliance with the human blacksmith. Same with the hammers, mini Golmarazes, every hammer forged by the Empire and the dwarfs with runes all over them, so they can just smack Chaos Warriors to death in one hit. Ridiculously heavy armour, just like Stormcast, but actually cool looking, to clad these warrior priests in, and they would have been massive. They could still go on the 40mm ogre-sized bases that ogres and trolls and the putrid blight kings and those sorts of units go on, so they're still Stormcast models, sized, essentially Stormcast sized models in badass looking Empire armour, Gothic armour, big 40mm bases, big angry warrior priests, massively muscly, 2 big hammers, 1 massive hammer, that sort of thing, just full on robes, priestly. a lot of the time their magic is about like fire and light, blinding, soul burning light. They could have easily just sprinkled in a bit of a retcon or whatever and had, these guys have lightning powers, you can throw lightning and summon lightning, because of Sigmar. He's granted them even more power than they used to have as regular warrior priests. So you could have still had Stormcasts in basically everything but name, and I think they would have fitted in really well because I like the idea behind them. I didn't pay too much attention to the fluff at the beginning of Age of Sigmar because I hated it, but as far as I could understand, the idea seemed to be that for the most part through Warhammer Fantasy, the relationship power balance between Chaos and the Empire has been Chaos Warriors, giant 7-foot muscle-bound guys with ridiculous inch-thick plate armor and maces as heavy as people, just blah, blah. And while the Empire were like regular guys in leotards without shoes, with like halberds just cowering and being slaughtered in their dozens, for each Chaos Warrior that falls, all that sort of thing. And I felt that the idea for the Stormcast was this idea that they were going to, they'd had enough of hiding, they had enough of being on the defensive back foot, and they're going to take the fight to Chaos. The Stormcast are forged specifically to be huge, heavily armoured, hard-hitting guys that just take the fight to Chaos, invade the realm of Chaos, and just give them a taste of their own medicine. And I think that mentality behind this new order of warrior priests would have been absolutely brilliant. Could have still fitted in, still said, that's it, Volton, Sigmar has said, we're not going to be hiding anymore. Next time the horses of Chaos come down from the north, we won't just be cowering behind the fortress gates, we'll throw them open and we'll smack them in the face with our new warrior priests. I think that would have been epic. I think they'd have looked better. I think they'd have, it would have been, people would have been happier to see them because they wouldn't have, ruined the entire world in order to exist. And that's what I'd have done in terms of the Stormcast. So yes, I think Stormcast could have existed within fantasy, and also that, what I've just been talking about is essentially what I would have done instead of Age of Sigmar. That's what I would have done. My setup for Warhammer 9th edition would have been Archeon and Chaos up here, Nagash and his Empire of the Undead down here, and then the rest of the world pushed together into these sort of grand alliances where you can have multiple armies all on the same side. And I would have had these sort of good guys, really get a bit of a power up, go for this full on war mode Sigmar thing with the giant, armies of warrior priests and all that sort of thing. I think that's what I would have done going forwards, and I think that it was, you can obviously tell me in the comments what you think of that. Is that terrible? Is that a shitty idea? Is it a good idea? Do you like it? Do you hate it? Let me know. And any ideas you have, please leave them in the comments because I want to read them. I want to see them. This isn't about me just telling you what should have happened. I want to hear all of your ideas. Even if you think that mine are terrible, whatever it might be, please put them down below. I will read them. I want to see them. But, speaking of other races, what else could have happened? Because there's a lot of nice things that have happened because of Age of Sigmar. And I'm not going to lie, even as much as I hated Age of Sigmar, and I really did hate it, I really did boycott it, even I couldn't resist getting an army of Nighthaunt, because those Nighthaunt ghost people are just the coolest things I've ever seen. And so I'm thinking, while I'm on this topic, why don't I talk about some other races and, could they have been in Warhammer as well? Not just the Stormcast. So taking Nighthaunts, I think Nighthaunt could have been in Warhammer Fantasy without ruining it too much. I don't like the idea of Nagash being a god in terms of his power, and I actually have a huge problem with how many everybody is a god in Age of Sigmar. Nagash is a god, Melkith is a god, Tyrion is a god, Marathi is a god, there's god beasts like the big Kragenos guy, everything's a bloody god, and everybody's a god, nobody's a god. It's stupid, it's like childish crap, I hate it. Everybody's a god, so who the fuck cares? Ridiculous. But so I wouldn't have had Nagash be a god in fantasy, but he is an unbelievably supremely powerful necromancer. He's a demigod, I guess you could say. One of the few people that could clarify could really count as being a demigod due to his power level. I would have had him sort of not directly, confronting, but chipping away, working behind the scenes, chipping away, really stretching the limits of his arcane power and his filthy knowledge of, forbidden lore. And I would have had him actually manage to peel between the sort of layers of unreality in the universe and make a split into the Vaults of Mor, the actual underworld, the Vaults of Mor, Mor being the god of death for as far as the human factions are concerned. He isn't kind of, fighting Mor or anything and throwing the gates open, but he's managed to, have this huge ritual or something go off, and he's managed to split open reality and actually pierce the Vaults of Mor. And now, I think decent Empire people go to a bit of a better place. I'm not going to get into that today because I've read about it in other books. Stop what I'm going to get into now. But I think that, the sort of the unworthy, the wretched, the dead, just cutthroats and thieves and lowlives and murderers, people who've got no real business going to any kind of decent afterlife. I think they pretty much just float around in some, miserable, forgotten sort of black abyss, in the Vaults of Mor. Kind of like how when you see in the Christmas Carol, you've got all these ghosts just floating around in the void with chains on and that sort of thing. I like the idea that he's, sort of pierced into the Vaults of Mor, and these, spiteful, forlorn soul spirits are just, floating out, and he's just, directing them where to go. I think that would have, for the sort of the grim dark setting of Warhammer Fantasy, I think that would have been a really good way of getting in some existential dread, cosmic horror, almost creepypasta levels of just kind of reality is broken. You know what I mean? Like he's actually pierced the underworld, the Vaults of Mor, the dead souls are actually drifting through. Like it's just that screwed up. Stuff is terrible. I like the idea of that. I think the Osark Bone Reapers, well, I hate them as a replacement for the Tomb Kings. I think that I'd have got into the idea of, the vampire counts, skeleton levies, zombies. They're just resurrected humans. The Tomb Kings are just skeletons of resurrected humans. I like the idea of the Osark Bone Reapers being Nagash's, his magnum opus, his big personal project that he's been working on to not just resurrect people, but create dead soldiers, to create constructs that he can animate so they're stronger and tougher than any other normal skeleton. And he's sort of, they're like he's using resurrected skeletons to achieve his goals, but his goals are creating the Osark Bone Reapers and creating this sort of elite Empire of the Dead with the Osark Bone Reapers. And I think they could have worked if you'd have had them as a faction alongside the Tomb Kings and the Vampire Counts, and you could have chosen whether you wanted to play all three or just a mono army of just Tomb Kings or something. I think that would have been nice. Who else have we got? We've got the those ocean elf people, the ocean elf people. I think they're stupid, weird, blind underwater elf people, but I think they could have been good as another Empire faction, because you have Manan, the god Manan of the ocean. I remember reading in a book, I think it was The Night of the Blazing Sun, in whatever the port city is, Marienburg maybe, I'm not sure. But there's the Manan Guard, I forget what they're called, Guard, the Deep Guard, the Ocean Guard, something. You will never be Ocean Master. Those people. And they were described as having like sort of carved, engraved fish scale armor, and being all covered in sort of verdigris and oxidization and rust and that sort of thing. Very, very maritime looking. I think that if those elf people had a more sort of had the human flair, a sort of empire flair, and they were the sort of the disciples of Manan, some kind of seafaring empire faction, powered by Manan. We're having water magic and ocean magic and that sort of thing. Maybe the guy with the huge cloak of water is some kind of High Templar of Manan, that sort of thing. That could have worked potentially. I think they're called the Cadron Overlords, something like that. Cadron Sky Overlords, the stupid looking steampunk dwarfs with like metal top hats and monocles and stuff. They look ridiculous, but they could have been pretty cool, and still ultimately have been included if they were just the idea that dwarfs tend to not like innovation that much, but these are desperate times, causing desperate measures, so they take the sorts of designs they have with the gyrocopter and stuff, and they go all out and they make essentially the Cadron Overlord stuff, the big blimps, the ship blimps and all this kind of stuff. They could have still done that, but just kept the sort of dwarven style, the sort of Celtic knotwork and the runes and that sort of thing, and just, you know, made it still like a kind of a futuristic-y, steampunky dwarf thing, but just, you know, not lost the style, and adopted this new ridiculous style where they've got like metal top hats and monocles and shit. So stupid. But, you know, could have been good. What else have we got for Age of Sigmar? It would have been easy to add any of the Chaos stuff, you know, Bloodbound and stuff, you know, that's all good. The Hedonites of Slaanesh, I'm a fan of. They're pretty good. They would work in fantasy perfectly fine as it is. Wouldn't have been any trouble bringing in things like that. Who else have we got? What new races have we got for Age of Sigmar? Lumineth Realm Lords, they're stupid as hell. I know High Elves always looked stupid to me anyway though, so I do think they could have, because the Isle of Ulthran is kind of a secret mystical isle anyway. They could have easily just had these sort of weird, you know, mountain goats people, the big stupid giant looking things they've got. They could have easily had them as a new unit. They could have easily adapted their already stupid giant helmets into the even more stupid looking giant helmets if they really wanted to. I think they could have pretty much, you know, got the Lumineth Realm Lords covered, you know, without changing the setting that much. They'd have worked out okay. Who else have we got for Age of Sigmar? I can't even remember. Can't remember everything now. Flesh Eater Corps, they didn't need to exist. Well, I can't think of any other races. I'm sure there are some off the top of my head. Can't think of any more. And this video is probably getting long enough as it is. So fundamentally, I think I've answered those 2 points. One, could Stormcast have been in fantasy without ruining the setting? Yes, I think they could, with some alterations that I explained. And, you know, what would I have done differently? What would I have done, in my opinion, better? You know, I've explained that, so that's up to you to judge, and I'll, you know, look forward to hearing your judgments too. So I hope this video is okay. Like I said, if you have any thoughts of your own, please leave them down below. I, you know, would love to read them. I'd love to see what you think, both of my, you know, my ideas and your own. And hopefully I'll see you in another fantasy video sometime soon. But I do need to get a lot of Thousand Sun stuff out of the way, so we'll see. I do want to get back to my book reviews. I know nobody really watched that many of them. I've only done 2 of them because, you know, they were something I did a long time ago when I was a much smaller channel and I was just sort of struggling and looking for things to do. I will get back to them though, so we'll finally find out what happened with Ulrika and that sort of thing. But anyway, thank you if you got this far. I hope you enjoyed it to some degree, and I'll see you soon.